When people think of weird Arabian borders, most will think about this quirky enclave that gets covered by many border videos. And on first glance, it's perfectly understandable why it gets so much attention. But the Gulf has much more serious border weirdness going on if you look elsewhere. But many of these just don't get the coverage that the friendly Omani UAE enclave enjoys. This video will explore 5 other borders which have led to diplomatic crises, an ICJ judgment, and also, why did one of these nations rule this tiny piece of Pakistan for nearly 200 years? And we'll also get to why that quirky Omani UAE enclave exists in the first place. The first stop is the Hawar Islands just off the Qatari mainland. On first glance, you could be forgiven for thinking they are just another part of Qatar. Looks like an open and shut case, right? Well, sadly, life is never that simple. Britain gave Bahrain the green light in 1939 to keep the islands, with Bahrain considered a more important ally than Qatar at the time. Qatar never accepted Bahrain's authority over the Hawars, and got increasingly annoyed at further Bahraini claims over its territory. Tensions snowballed over time, leading to a tense standoff in 1986. This paved the way for a long-awaited ICJ decision in 2001, which awarded the islands to Bahrain, but rejected all Bahraini claims to the Qatari mainland. No one has had a bigger impact on the borders in the Gulf than this man, Ibn Saud, the founder and first king of Saudi Arabia. He was considered an important and effective regional player by the British. They saw him as a way to reduce Ottoman influence in the Gulf, and good for regional stability. But he wasn't always the best neighbour. Kuwait found this out to their peril, when it lost most of its territory to Ibn Saud at the 1922 Uqair Conference. This led to the formation of a large neutral zone. This was the British representative Percy Cox's way of kicking the can down the road, while keeping the Saudi leader on side. The land was split and finalised between the two countries in 1970, but still share oil rights in the former zone as of 2025. Next we move on to the Qatar-Saudi Arabia border. This became one of the most famous borders in recent times when it was closed between 2017 and 2021. The Saudis even considered digging a canal on the border, such were the tensions between the two countries. But this border has a history of being a bit of a problem. In fact, most atlases you look at will have their own take on where the line actually is. Qatar and Saudi Arabia tried in 1935 and 1965 to draw a border, but just could not agree on where it exactly should be. This led to a serious incident in 1992, where Qatari soldiers were attacked by Saudi forces in the area. An agreement was eventually reached in 2001, but the position of the line itself was not publicised. Remember, there are no towns or villages in this area, so keeping this secret didn't exactly lead to any disruptions. But the two countries get on much better now, and this may have led to another change in late 2021, as the border moved yet again, with Qatar now getting both sides of its famous inland sea. But this is a move that might irk the United Arab Emirates in our next border. This is yet to be resolved over 50 years after a treaty to finalise the line. This is the contentious Saudi border with the UAE. In the early 1970s, the small, newly independent Qatar and UAE shared a land border between them. But there was a problem. Saudi Arabia wasn't happy. There was an urban legend that the Saudis didn't want its smaller neighbours joined, as the Emirates was considered too liberal by Riyadh, and it didn't want Qatar to head down the same path. The 1974 Treaty of Jeddah is where the trouble started. Saudi Arabia was still seething from its climb down during the Bahrain incident, a 3-year-long standoff over a fertile oasis that was believed to be oil-rich in the 1950s. But there was also a bit of a proxy tussle here. US companies had drilling rights to Saudi oil, so it was in America's interest for Saudi Arabia to expand. With British help, the Trucial States, the former name of the UAE, and Omani forces pushed the Saudis back. So when talks began in 1974 for Saudi Arabia to finally recognise the United Arab Emirates and formalise relations, the Saudis were determined to overturn their Bahraini embarrassment. The UAE claimed their former ruler, Sheikh Zayed, was pressured into signing with his country young and fragile after the British departure from the Gulf. The Emiratis also claimed what was agreed verbally was different to the written agreement. The Treaty of Jeddah saw the UAE give up a significant chunk of land, cutting across oil and gas reserves. It also acted as a literal block between Qatar and UAE relations. The UAE government never ratified the treaty and have never given up hope of getting their land back. But similar to many countries around the world, the borders change depending on whose map you look at. But you can't talk about Gulf borders without mentioning the Omani UAE enclave. The discovery of oil in the 20th century brought an urgency to draw borders in a region where tribal loyalty was the nearest thing they had to a line on the ground. Perhaps sensing disappointment in how they'd negotiated Kuwait's boundaries, Britain decided to be more careful in plotting the borders between each of the Emirates and its ally Oman during the 1930s and 40s. Britain extensively consulted local tribes about their loyalties, whether Trucial State or Omani. They must have learnt by this stage that this would be better for stability and imperial interests than simply drawing straight lines dividing communities, which would lead to bigger problems down the road. When the British surveyors arrived at Madha, the area's tribal leaders believed Oman offered them a more stable and prosperous future, while a bit further down the wadi in Nahwa, the leaders opted for Sharjah. The British, wanting to prevent any trouble, then drew the border to keep both sides happy. The lines today correspond to the land controlled by each of the tribes, using British cartography methods at the time. Also note, this is a very mountainous area, adding some complexity to the lines. Finally, we head to a place that used to be part of a Gulf nation for nearly 200 years, until it was sold to Pakistan in 1958. This is Gwadar, a weirdly shaped peninsula and port that used to be part of Oman. In fact, Oman had an extensive maritime empire that included quite a bit of Africa. Gwadar had been given to an exiled Omani sultan by the Khan of Kalat in 1783. When the sultan returned to Oman a decade later, rather than giving the enclave back, he simply integrated Gwadar into his empire. It was later considered a vital strategic and commercial outpost and had British support. But by the 1950s, a newly independent Pakistan wanted it back. The British had changed their minds too, and thought it would be better for Pakistan's stability to get a useful port. Oman, yet to discover oil at the time, and with its own concerns at home, preferred the money over an impractical enclave that it just didn't need anymore. There are some other Gulf borders that I didn't cover in this video, so be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll produce another video if it's interesting exploring the others. Thanks very much for watching.